This is a very volatile time to make content here, but I did want to make some content, right? I know it's crazy, right? Farfa making his own content. So I wanted to show you this thing, right? Because it's very important. I talked about this a while ago, but it's a very important bit that I wanted to extrapolate upon a little bit further, because I think it's extremely important, since, you know, a lot of people are, like, coming up to the YCS season, like, what deck do I play and stuff, right? I'm gonna give you guys 2 concepts that are brand new and never been discussed before in Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, we've got two sections here that are very important. All right, so at the very bottom here, we've got something called the skill floor. And then up here, we've got something called the skill ceiling. These are your archetypes. Now, what deck do I play for a YCS? Well, first you're gonna ask yourself, how good are you with the game? How good are you at the game? All right, so let's start with example exhibit A, deck number 1. What is the single most easiest, simplest deck you can think of in Yu-Gi-Oh? It's Invoked. All right, without a shadow of a doubt, I think everyone can agree Invoked is probably one of the simplest decks ever made in this game. Here's the skill floor of Invoked, right? It's all the way down here, all right? All the way down here. Right here, Invoked is down there, right? It's got absolutely no way of really doing anything crazy or difficult or hard. Pretty much anyone can pick it up and play it quite well, all right? Now, we're talking like the absolute Timmy drooler that goes to your locals and has to call a judge because he ended up with some sort of like physical like injury, like he strained his like back revealing Moyi. The absolute bare minimum drooler is down here, right? The skill floor is at the bottom, right? So that's where Invoked is. And that's not a diss, and that's not a bad thing, because it's very important for a card game to have easy decks and have decks that are simpler to play, right? Because it just makes more sense for people to have that access. Because here's the thing, right? Timmy the Drooler comes home from a hard day at work. His boss is shouting at him, telling him to do shit that isn't his responsibility. He has to work overtime and not get paid for it. So he comes home and he sees his wife having sex for the 3rd time this month with his best friend. And he's like, oh, I just want to turn off my brain and get away from life for a little bit, right? So he goes down into his man cave, he sits and relaxes, logs into Master Duo, crafts with his gems, and builds his beautiful, amazing new content, and he normal summons Alistair, right? Doesn't want to have to think about anything, doesn't want to have to, like, consider, like, the tribulations and things in life. He just wants to sit down, relax, and play a simple deck, right? That's reasonable. Now, the thing with Invoked is that because of the fact that it's a very low skill floor, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to have a low skill ceiling, right? Because you can have a deck that has a low skill floor, but also have a high skill ceiling. Invoked, however, probably has a low skill ceiling anyway, right? Because here's a question. What is the difference between Timmy the Drooler and the absolute mega brain, giant, huge cranium Invoked player in Yu-Gi-Oh? The gap is not that hard. It's not that far apart. Do you know what I mean? And the reason for that is because of the fact that it just simply has a lower skill ceiling. Okay, let's do a line here to connect it. Okay, yep, and the arrow goes up. Wee, boo, 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 boo. Okay, so like the skill floor and the skill ceiling is probably quite low generally for most decks here. Okay, that's pretty much how it works. Now, some decks have an extremely high skill ceiling. Okay, let's think of the most complicated deck ever made in Yu-Gi-Oh! Right? Just as a basic example, I don't know how meta it was, but like the most absolute freaking big brain, that like hugest, like you need like 10,000 spreadsheets to be able to like, you know, come up with that deck, right? Let's go with like DDD, okay? When it was meta for a grand total of like 2 weeks in 2017, all right? So on the other extreme end is you're gonna have like DDD all the way up here, okay? It's like super hard, you know? Like you would have to like realistically, you'd have to like get like, I don't know, pack, lock him inside of a fucking Brazilian jail, inject cocaine directly into his eyeballs, and tell him to like find God. And then he sits there for like 10 hours a day for an entire week and then spreadsheets out the entire deck and archetype, and he comes up with like the best plays and writes it down, and then suddenly we have like a full manual on actually how to play the deck. Where's the skill floor of DDD? I mean, anyone can pick up DDD and just activate a bunch of effects and do something, but it's probably still going to have a bit of a high skill floor. Even at the most basic entry level, it's probably quite hard to play DDD. It's still going to be like here somewhere. Now, you see the difference between these two, and this doesn't mean one deck is better than the other, okay? Even though like now, currently, you could say Invoked is probably better than DDD, without a doubt, you know? And there's lots of good players who play Invoked because, you know, if they think it's a meta call, it's particularly good against like the current meta and the current game and all that kind of stuff, right? So these are the two major extremes that you have in Yu-Gi-Oh! For measuring skill in a deck, right? You have the absolute top end of that would be like a super brain deck like DDD, and then you have like Timmy the Driller's Invoke deck, right? And then everything else is maybe in between, right? And then you have decks that has a very small gap between a good player and a bad player, right? Because the difference between them is not that good. Now, here's an interesting one that I think falls perfectly in the middle, right? I think Sword Soul has a pretty low skill ceiling, floor, but probably has quite a high skill ceiling. So Sword Soul is a very easy entry-level deck. It's not hard to just Moyi reveal, make a synchro, get a trap, and set, and then just drop some disruptions, right? It's very simple, very, very linear. To really fully take full advantage of the deck, there's going to be massive differences between a perfect Sword Soul player, right? Like Pac sitting in the Brazilian jail, and then like Timmy the Driller playing Sword Soul, right? It's going to be night and day, just how different those players are. So the gap between the bottom and the top is massive, right? Compared to something like Invoked, which is a bit of a tinier gap. Do you know what I mean? The gap between a good Invoke player and a bad Invoke player is really just not that high. Is that you have like a deck that's easy to access and very simple to get into, and then you have decks that are harder to get into, and you need to judge for yourself how much out of your deck are you going to get. Now, you could look at something like Invoked, and I would argue if you're a good player, you shouldn't play Invoked. It's harder to outplay your opponent with something like Invoked, because the maximum amount of like skill you can extract out of that one single archetype is going to be harder than what you can extract out of like Sword Soul, right? Because if you are that good at the game and you are perfect and you're a technical play and your reads, I think you will get more value from playing a deck with a higher skill ceiling and a deck that has more branches and options available to it at any one time, whereas Invoked has a very simple linear combo, and you're essentially relying on the variance that your opponent doesn't see an out to like window, and you're relying on your format knowledge to be able to drop your disruptions. Because people would argue and say like, oh, well, actually, Invoked is difficult because you need to know when to use the Makaba. You need to know when to like flip your Imperm or drop your Ash Blossom. Just fucking flip Schism and you win the game anyway. But assuming you don't have the window access, right? Those are valid points, right? So why does that not matter? That's not unique to Invoked. Knowing when to drop your Makaba or your Ash Blossom or whatever, that is not something unique to that deck. Sword Soul has to know when to use its negates as well. Every deck in the game needs to know when to use its negate. So that is not a unique thing to Invoked. All right. Any questions, class? How good is Red Dragon Archfiend? I sat here explaining this whole entire fucking TED Talk for you, and your question is, how good is Red Dragon Archfiend, bro? Why the BA no die? Okay. You want to know where BA is? BA is here. BA is just like basically like Boneless Invoked. It's like a slightly higher skill floor and slightly higher skill ceiling, because BA doesn't have a floodgate to carry it if you don't know what you're doing. I'm trying to think of an example of a deck that has a high skill floor and skill ceiling. Here's like a random deck I think fits quite nicely, right? Like probably like all the way up here, right? You could probably put something like, you know, these like combo frickin' what's it called decks, like Megalith, right? I'm not like super versed in it, but I'm pretty sure like even playing this deck at a basic level is like hard. You know, a deck that's like has so many options available to it from your turn one, and then you kind of just have to like solitaire and free-for-all your way up there. Historically, I think the best example of this is probably something like Synchro Fusionist, right? That deck was difficult to play at a basic level, and it was difficult to play at a top level. You have to ask yourself, like, where is my skill level? Because there's no point in taking, you know, the Synchro Fusionist equivalent deck to a YCS when your skill floor is, you know, down the way at fucking Beatrice Pass. Fluffle is DDD, but with a higher skill floor. I'm gonna press X to doubt. Do you know why? Yeah, I don't think Fluffle has this many expansive combos. Your agency as a player is able to dictate the match better because you have more influence through your skill, and the cards allow you to express that skill well. And Invoke doesn't let you do that. It doesn't matter how good and insane your hand is or you are at your deck, it will always just have like 2 plays. Striker has a bit of a higher skill ceiling, but the skill floor for Striker is quite low. Like, Striker is easy entry level, I think, right? Anyone can just pick up Striker and play it, you know, to a relatively okay level. And the difference between a good Striker player and a bad Striker player is very apparent. So yeah, there's a gap between a good and bad Striker player. Invoked is just a modern-day Bujin deck. That's pretty much all it is. It's got a couple of extra, like, extenders, you know? Your Fusion Destiny is basically your Bujin Carnation. You got all your Searchers. Bujin, you know, if anyone historically remembers this, I was always, like, very confused that, like, when good players played Bujin. Let's say you have the best deck in the room, right? Fucking Patrick Hoban on a Pegasus winged horse chariot flies down from the clouds and heaven and falls into your bedroom and hands you a shining gold-plated necklace, and he says, "Play this, my child." Right? But it's like some 5-head, like, Chaos Dragon Link, like, PK combo deck. You're not gonna get any value out of it because you're gonna fuck up every play, you're gonna mess up the combo, you're gonna misplay constantly, and then you're gonna drop after 3 rounds, and then you're gonna go back home and you're gonna find your wife cheating on you yet again.